Is there a writing craft book on your bedside table? Has it been there for a while?
Do you keep meaning to get past chapter 2, or chapter 1, or just the first page?
Then the Words to Write By podcast is for you. Hi, I'm Renee. I teach composition and creative writing to college students. My background is in poetry, but I'm working on my memoir.
And I'm Kim. I'm trained as a science journalist, but now I'm trying my hand at short fiction. Each week we'll be tackling a chapter of some well-known, but perhaps not so well-read, writing craft book.
Together, we'll uncover brilliant insights, face the hard truths, and totally disagree when the author is wrong.
This is our podcast, after all.
And then, we're going to take what we learn and apply it to our own writing.
By doing the book's suggested exercises.
We're inviting you to read along, or just tune in for the Cliff Notes version.
We're committed to improving our own craft, one writing advice book at a time, and we'd love for you to join us. Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Words to Write By.
Welcome!
Before we get started, I just want to remind you that we are doing some fun meetup groups on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday at 5 p.m. California time, Pacific Standard Time. We have a meetup group. You can find the link on our webpage, and we alternate between a process group where a bunch of writers get together and talk about how hard it is to write or questions we might have regarding our own writing, but it's not a critique group. And then on the other Wednesdays, we have a just come together and write session for 2 hours. And we like to start that with a little writing lesson, mini craft lesson that Renee puts together. All right, let's get started on writing the memoir. We are kind of in the halfway point of the book right now, which means it's time to start combining chapters.
Yeah. Is it suffering from the midway? What's it called? The curse of the writing craft book? Or
I think just nonfiction in general. At a certain point, you kind of you meander a little bit in the middle.
We should give it a name. The midpoint. Mm-hmm. The midpoint craft book blues.
In her defense, like she has a couple of points she wants to get to, but none of the points are that big. And the first point is a chapter on moving around in time and tenses. We're getting into the grammar tenses in this chapter.
Oh, grammar. Everyone loves grammar, right? Right, kids? Kids?
You took a class in it, didn't you?
Oh, my golly, yes. So it was very traumatic. They no longer have it, or if they do, it's an elective probably barely anybody takes at San Francisco State University. In the 70s, they were one of the leading graduate departments doing research on sentence combining and using grammar to help students write better.
I feel really sorry for the PhD graduate student that had to tell his family that his dissertation was how to combine sentences, how to use the word and properly.
Yes, that's the easy one, the coordinating conjunction and, yes. But think of it more as taking sentences and using like modifiers to combine them, not just with an and, but like say a noun phrase, a positive. For example, Kim, my favorite co-host, is sitting in the chair next to me. My favorite co-host is a noun phrase, a positive. Now, that is two sentences combined together of Kim is sitting in the chair next to me, and Kim is my favorite co-host.
Which is a reason why you should not do your PhD in grammar. Okay, but since you have this knowledge, how about we just go through what the verb tenses are for all of us listeners who have, repressed it over the years.
Okay, I just want to say, as someone who teaches composition, I do tend to avoid grammar, believe it or not, because they have done studies and they have found that doing grammar activities that are like, activity pages, where you just give people like graphs to work on and stuff, doesn't do any good. Just saying.
Either they suck at grammar or they don't, and doing worksheets won't change it.
Doing worksheets won't change it. You know what will change it? Reading. That's how you get better at grammar. Reading and writing and reading and writing. So get to it, dear listener.
Anyway, so everyone knows present tense is.
Present tense. She does have examples in this book. She says the present tense is I see and she walks.
Mm-hmm. The past tense is I saw, they talked.
Present perfect is I have seen, he has eaten.
Is present perfect happening now or is it happening in the past?
It's happening in the past.
Okay.
But wait, okay, no. I have seen this, right? Is that the past or the...
That would be the past.
Right.
But why is it called present then?
Because it has this idea that it's something you're still kind of doing.
Okay. Past perfect. I had seen, it had flown. This is completely in the past. Double past verbs to make sure we know it.
Right. Believe it or not, I never memorized this stuff. Mm-hmm. I can check grammar, but I can't tell you what verb tense you're in.
From a writer perspective, when I use something in the basic past, it's nice and short. When I use something in the past perfect or present perfect, it's longer, more elegant sentences. I almost just do it kind of based on rhythm and feel, as opposed to actually a grammatical reason why I use one or the other.
Right, and then that's why you have an editor. They'll just fix it for you.
Okay, so now that that's all clear in everyone's
mind.
mind.
Everyone's so clear on this. Yeah, just don't even worry about it, dear listener, really.
Why does she say that this is important for memoir? Why is time important for memoir?
Well, she brings up a very important concept. On page 1 of this chapter, she says, the first thing to remember is that there must be a quote-unquote now. The reader must have a sense that the narrator is rooted in a particular moment from which he or she may look back, may speak in present tense, or may look forward to the future. The now doesn't have to be explicit.
But it has to be, as opposed to if you're writing fiction in first person, past tense. First of all, somebody reading it assumes that the narrator is still alive at some point, but we don't, it doesn't have to be grounded. Like, I know that the narrator of this first person fiction I'm reading is still there, is recounting this stuff, but they could be recounting it as an 80-year-old or they could be recounting it as the week later. It doesn't really matter as I'm reading the story, but for memoir, it does.
It does matter because you're going to be doing flashbacks. For example, in my book, there is a now, and the now is me writing about the events that happened in the past. They are happening like right now, right in my mid-40s.
Is the now happening with your mother in the hospice? Is the now happening even like now as you're looking back?
There is a now that I'm looking back. There is a Renee's in the hospital with mom now, but I wouldn't call that a now, right? Because that's going to get confusing.
Yet still written in the past.
Actually written in the present tense, and it's what I was going through during that time.
Okay.
And then I have flashbacks, and those are in the past tense, and those flashbacks happen both while I'm in the hospital with mom, but then I also have chapters that are only in the past tense because they're about me growing up.
And they are not linked to you in the hospital with mom or you in the hospice with mom.
No, they are not linked.
And the now from which you are telling the story, is that also in present tense?
I'll have to look at my phone. I actually can't even think about it. Like, I don't even know. I'm pretty sure I've got to be consistent, right?
Right, because the now that's telling the story is happening after your mother has passed away, after the funeral has happened, after you're kind of taking stock of stuff. So do you refer to any events that are happening in that now, or is it just kind of an anchor point from which everything else goes?
It's just an anchor point.
So you never actually talk about what you're doing in the now. Or maybe you talk about it in kind of a infinitive, sort of like my husband tells me I do such and such kind of thing?
Yes. So here's an example. In one of the chapters, I take my mom to the Nutcracker in San Francisco, and she's in the gift shop, and we're buying, and I'm going to buy her some earrings and a Nutcracker. And I describe the earrings as, I buy my mother some earrings, which she will be buried in a year from now. Mm-hmm. But the whole time I'm writing as if it's the perspective of me right there, then and now, at that point. But it's not that now. The now is taking place after my mother's death.
So why did you decide to write certain things? Like, was that organic that you just ended up writing certain things in present tense and certain things in past tense? Or was it a conscious decision at a certain point?
It's hard to explain. So I wrote a lot. Like, some people know how they're going to put a book together, I think, and they just write it. I did not. And so some of the things that I was writing was kind of all over the place. Some things were, I'm going to write this thing about my mom in the hospital. But then I would write a thing about this funny event that happened when I was a kid, and I threw a party for no reason, right? And those stories had a beginning, middle, and end. They were probably from a prompt that I was given in a workshop class. So I had these two stories. Like I had a story of when I was a kid, not from the perspective as a kid, but pretty close. Mm-hmm. And it's from the past. But then I have one where I'm writing as if it's the present. And I'm like, well, how do I marry those two together? And I originally was going to just go, well, all the stuff from when I was a kid, I'm throwing it out. I can't use it in this book. I'm just going to do the one about mom in the hospital. But then I realized, no, they actually work together. Mm-hmm. We went on the retreat, and I had all these note cards out. Mm-hmm. And I even wrote on note cards the ones about being a kid. And I realized that they're all speaking to each other, and I paired them up. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh my gosh, the themes in this note card about my mom in the hospital is directly related to the other.
Okay, but when you were writing these up, did you just naturally fall into writing the ones in the hospital in the present tense, or did you make this decision and then you went back and as you're reworking them, you're bumping them to present tense?
I reworked them and moved them into the present tense.
So you naturally wrote in the past tense.
I did. I naturally wrote in the past tense, and then when I was writing about my mom in the hospital, since it had happened didn't happen that long ago. Mm-hmm. I did write in the past tense, and then I realized, no, it sounds better in the present.
Yeah. So for most of the writing out there, it's going to be in past tense. Most fiction and most memoir, you pick a book and you run into past tense.
That's the standard default.
But she says in this book that there are new ways of doing things, and they're now starting to write things in the present tense.
So new is something referred to in the 90s. So she says this is new, but that was in the 90s, and that was not 10 years ago, was 30 years ago.
Right. But still, if you go through the books in your bookcase, chances are they're going to be past tense, just because that's kind of a standard.
Right. Most of the time they are. Mm-hmm. Most of the time. I was reading, I think it was LitHub, an article or an interview with an author who published a memoir in the present tense. And it was about grief. And it was so, I don't know, it felt very conceited. She said the reason she chose to use the present tense was because grief is ongoing and it doesn't end. And I'm like, what? Really? Really?
Because there have been a lot of people in this world have written about grief very eloquently in the past tense, and it's worked.
It seemed like something she had maybe lied awake at night going, oh my God, that's such a cool idea. I'll just say that in an interview. It didn't sound genuine to me. Maybe it was, but it seemed a little ick.
Barrington has two reasons why she thinks people like to write in the present. First is the immediacy. It's happening now. And that just, that kind of gets you closer to the emotions, closer to the person's mind, because you're watching things kind of unfurl. And the other one is someone saying that it gives the illusion of significance. This is important, people. It's written in present tense.
That's funny. It would be safe to say when I write in present tense, it just sounded better. I read it out loud and I'm reading it out loud and I'm like, you know what? The parts with mom in the hospital, it felt pretty immediate.
This is something I've been thinking about recently in my fiction book because, like you, I just kind of started writing things and things felt a particular way. My book is a portal fantasy, meaning people from our world are traveling to a fantasy world. And I've broken the book into two different points of views. The main character, Kyle, is telling everything from first person, present tense. And then I also include chapters from people in the fantasy world, and that's third person, and I was doing it past tense, largely because majority of fantasy books that are written in third person are written past tense. And that was fine, except at a certain point someone pointed out that these scenes or these perspectives jump sometimes in the same fight scene. And suddenly it's very odd to be in the present in a fight scene and suddenly be in the past in a fight scene and then back in the present in the fight scene. So I was deciding which one I should switch. The other reason was I talked to an editor and she said, if you do it that way, your audience is going to expect some reason for it. And since there wasn't a reason, since, I wasn't explaining how grief was ongoing, I decided I'd unify them.
So you're saying they didn't have like trauma associated with jumping portals, and somehow that meant that they had to be in the present tense?
I did a bit of research, and writing fiction first person means it's much more immediate. Like they said, it's much more reactionary. If you write it past tense, you're more contemplative. And I looked at it and said, no, I want Kyle's perspective to be reactionary. So that has to be present. So that meant I looked at the third person and said, wait a second, third person present tense? That's weird. But it does happen, even in books that you read. You want to know a book that's written in third person present?
Which book?
Neil Stephenson's Cryptonomicon.
Interesting.
So it can be done. But in case you have to do this, folks, going through 20 chapters like this is a really good use for AI, because I've discovered that I can take it 3 pages at a time, throw it into Gemini, which is Google's AI currently, and I can say, put this in present tense, and it will just go through and it'll change all the tenses.
So wait, wasn't it called Bard?
It was called Bard.
And now it's called Gemini.
Yes.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
No, it doesn't.
Well, I haven't heard, no one's been talking about Google Bard, but now I get it. I'm Gemini. Okay. All right. So you essentially just had it edit it for you.
Yes. And basically I went through and it changed all the tenses for me, and it made sure that all the sentences made sense. So I didn't have to actually go through and physically change the tenses. But then what I found is that certain things that, like the way sentences are run, it has to be more immediate too. So you can't be putting a bunch of clauses in front of stuff and then getting to the action. You almost have to make sure that you're always writing in a more active voice. Did you find that when you're writing your scenes to your mother, that they're more active, more cinematographic?
Yeah, they are, because it feels like when I'm writing in present tense, and that when I'm writing about my mom in the hospital, things are happening to me. Mm-hmm. I'm discovering things there. You know, I'm like, oh, wow, she looks really shitty today. You know, and she looks this way and she's saying these things, and I'm having these immediate feelings.
Or like if you're coming in and she's looking different, you don't want to start the scene by basically we're playing cards right now and I'm looking at my mother and she's looking this way. You're more likely to say, I come into the hospital room and I see her looking this way.
Yes.
That's kind of the change.
That's a neat trick. Mm-hmm. Do you use AI for anything else?
I've been thinking about asking it to go through my text and find out if I have any comma splices or other like grammar things that I don't understand, but that I want to get out of it.
Do you need to specifically ask for specific grammar stuff?
Possibly not, but I don't necessarily want to give it too much power.
You can't just say proofread.
I'll try that too, but I think I might actually have to ask it specifically. Do you think this chapter was a good chapter?
I think there were aspects of it that were really fascinating and interesting and helpful, and there were lots that I did not think were very helpful. I got the sense that she's read a lot of student work, and she's had to teach grammar a lot to students, and it probably annoys her because it annoys everybody. I thought the thing about the now, readers don't care about the exact date or even the decade. What they care about is a sense that it now exists, and that now anchors a logical time span. I'd never heard it said before, and now that it's in my face, it's kind of cool. Like, it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. This explains why there are multiple narrators, right? There's the now narrator, and then there's the narrator from the past.
Right, and then the way, way past.
And then the way, way past, exactly. And so some people might get confused about how to go into flashback, and this is a nice little trick that she has. What she does is she has this chart, and it's a timeline, and you use signposts or preparatory phrases to just alert the reader to where they are in relation to wherever now is. And not only does it look kind of cool in the book, but it's really helpful because some people don't know how to get into a flashback in a way that's not confusing.
Right, or sometimes you write very organically and you look back and you realize the reason why the person reading it is having a hard time figuring out is because you've been jumping around in time. You haven't actually been acknowledging it.
Right. Also, what I find fascinating is that it can get a little confusing And the reader will follow you all the way through and not even realize they've jumped to like 3 different timelines in 2 paragraphs, as long as you put the right signposts in. I find that fascinating. I'm just like, wow, readers don't even notice all this stuff going on. That's so cool. I don't know. Did you find anything interesting in this chapter or helpful?
I mean, I liked the overall chapter. I think it was a bit tricky. I had to really concentrate while I was reading it because when she's talking about jumping in time and talking about different tenses, it got confusing. But I also think that if you don't understand the stuff and you're writing a memoir, you'll make it confusing to other people. And this is a good way to sort out your memoir.
Yeah. Another thing I really liked was she mentions reading. If you ask an author what can you do to become a better writer, they should say this, and they probably will. They'll say read. Do they tell you what to do while you're reading or how to read? No. They'll just say read. And so it's a great bit of advice that people don't always follow, but also it's a cop-out. So what she puts in here is she actually gives you an activity or activities of what to do while you're reading in terms of learning how to do this jumping around in time. She says that my advice is to practice jumping back and forth without losing your reader. Read memoirs, specifically noting the way the authors include different periods of time. Read avidly and read with an eye to what you can learn. And she actually has an activity in the back under the suggestions for writing about find 2 or 3 short memoirs, and for each one create a timeline. As you make the timeline, list in your notebook the words or phrases the author uses to pinpoint a particular time, whether it be a specific day or an identifiable span of time. Phrases such as later that day, when I moved to Philadelphia, my 2nd year in college, or long before that summer, and so on.
Yeah, I think that actually might be a good one to do, partly because I don't want to do any more writing right now, and that's good and analytical. So that will be our exercise, and we'll mention it again at the end of the podcast.
Yeah. It's kind of cool to get an activity like this because it's like, oh, you're even looking for grammar when you're reading, like how they're getting in and out of a scene instead of just reading passively and hoping that it sticks.
Yeah. Okay, and now we get to the second chapter, and it's called Using Your Senses. I think almost every craft book that actually identifies writing has a section about how you're supposed to use your senses.
Bickham didn't.
Yeah,
but Gardner called it verisimilitude, sensory details.
Yeah.
You have, 5 senses, right?
plus some extras.
Like
touch can also include heat, but I always kind of consider temperature to be kind of an extra sense.
Really?
Do you consider it the same as touch?
Well, yeah, because you touch it and then you feel it.
But if you walk into a room and it's cold,
Well, you're feeling the air on your skin.
I suppose so. I always kind of think of that kind of as a bonus.
A bonus. I love it. Okay. When we write a craft book, dear listener, there's going to be the bonus senses. All right. So, yeah, this one is called Using Your Senses. Mm-hmm. What did you think about this one?
I like the little box she had there called concrete and abstract. That just lays it out. Concrete nouns are those that can be experienced by one or more of the 5 senses. Abstract nouns are those that can be experienced only by the mind. They are ideas. Beauty, evil, danger, confusion, and love are abstract nouns. Abstract nouns are likely to make your writing dull. I think that kind of sums it up right there.
Yeah. I have an activity, like slides, and I actually a whole day on concrete and abstract writing. Good writing uses concrete language. Mm-hmm. It doesn't use vague, abstract terms. That's when people start getting on like philosophical bends. Mm-hmm.
Although I will point out that in the example on page 113, this is the good writing. It starts off with cut wet grass, spit green apples, baby shit and beer bottles, cheap makeup and motor oil. So she's got some very concrete stuff. But then it jumps to, that country was beautiful. I swear to you, the most beautiful place I've ever been. Beautiful and terrible. So that's a lot of abstract stuff right there.
Who wrote this?
This is Dorothy Allison.
From 2 or 3 Things I Know for Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you do switch from...
Right. She gives a whole bunch of concrete nouns and stuff and sensory stuff, and then she can jump to beautiful and terrible.
Right. She defined what beautiful and terrible was. As long as you define it, you're going to be okay. But also you have to take a step back. You can't always be super close. Like you can't always write in just scene. That doesn't follow the show don't tell rule. That goes too far.
Yeah, you can't always show, which is we've covered in the podcast is one thing that Renee learned.
Yes. So why do we do this? Well, according to Gardner, he says that it creates that dream in the reader's head. It's like they're watching a movie in their head while they're reading the book. So that's one of the reasons, or that's the reason he says. But the reason she says is because it helps you get to know the characters and probably the plot and everything. But you can't really get to know a person without knowing specific details and getting a feel for who they are. She says, your readers must, to some degree, make their own acquaintance with the characters through the sensory details you provide. She has some examples from Why the Caged Bird Sings from Maya Angelou. And you know what? These are great. One of them is, on my way into church, I saw Sister Monroe, her open-faced gold crown glinting when she opened her mouth to return a neighborly greeting.
Yeah. Although I will say that, I had a hard time quite parsing what a open-faced gold crown glistening when she opened her mouth.
A gold crown? She had gold teeth.
Ah, I see. You're right.
Do you still have all your teeth?
I do, but...
Nice. So she meant that she had like
gold
teeth, and she didn't mind. She was big, she smiled, didn't care. Here's another one from Ginny Al-Hadaf's The Sun at Midnight, Tales of a Mediterranean Family. Now in his 30s, Vittorio had shrunk. He seems a little man, which I am certain he never was. His goatee is clipped in the shape of an arrow pointing downward, quite large ears and nose, sharp eyes behind glasses. He dresses carefully in the style of European gentlemen of his time. Perfumed tailoring. Like, these are very different people.
Yes.
Very, very different. But we get to know them.
But I think part of it's also the way that the details are delivered. Because one mistake people sometimes make is that they will give you a full description of a person right away and you won't catch it. So what I like about both of these ones, especially that second one, is that, you're drawn to certain details like that goatee. It is clipped in the shape of an arrow pointing downward. If you said he had a goatee, large ears and nose, he wore glasses with sharp eyes, like that kind of list sort of thing doesn't work.
You're writing a book, not a character sheet, right?
Right.
And sometimes people forget. I don't actually know what people are thinking when they just put like a description. Like I've heard people say they have a hard time getting descriptions of people. Like people will look in the mirror and then describe their own features in the book. And I'm like, oh, do they? But I guess people are trying to find excuses to describe people.
You want the person to be visual in the reader's mind. You want them to be able to distinguish between the different characters, and one of those is visuals. So you're reading through and say, oh, that's the middle-aged dad. That's the dorky third grader. Like they got an idea of who they are.
Right.
And they can distinguish and they don't get confused about who's who.
Right. And maybe just don't overdo it. I don't know. It depends on the style you're going for.
I like this line here, which is, it is not a matter of throwing an abundance of details, say of a person's visual appearance at the reader, but of selecting those few that capture the essence of the person. So coming up with the magic rule of 3. If you come up with 3 details about the person, that's good. Or the other one is that you don't have to give every detail about the person. You can like start when you see this person, like really briefly, like golden blonde hair or something. And then later on you can mention as they talk that their voice sounds this way, or as they walk that their body moves this way. So you can add those details as you progress through the plot.
Yeah. She also says that all of this advice for characters can be placed on places too. Like you can use it to reveal places. I've said this actually in workshop, but other people have said this too, and I've heard to other people's work is some people say, wow, that description was so good. You turned that place into a character. I thought it was kind of cool. I was like, okay, yeah. Because if you describe a place well enough, not the sky, don't just describe the sky. Because that is not an error, a rookie move.
The Steven Universe TV series.
Uh-huh.
They said Montreal's like a character. I wonder who's going to play him.
Oh, God. There's Carl the Fog, right? They've named the fog in San Francisco Carl, so that fog is a character. Mm-hmm. Somebody could play Carl.
I think we've pretty much covered this. Is there anything else you want to bring up?
Beyond just making sure you use a lot of concrete language as opposed to abstract language, or you have a good ratio of the two, there's a couple of side effects. So sometimes when you're writing in concrete, she says that it might be tempting to spare the reader some of the painful sensory details, yet it is these very details that make the writing powerful. Unfortunately, if you're writing a memoir and there's some hard stuff, people kind of want to see it.
They might not want to see it, but afterwards they'll mention you didn't put it in.
Yeah, it helps them identify that people read it because they want to know what it's like from somebody else's perspective to live through something. Like A Child Called It. That was a really disturbing memoir, but it's one of the most famous ones, like sold so many copies. And it still continues to sell copies. I mean, it is about a boy who's been tortured and people read it. They can't look away. Anyway, so she says whether the memories involve physical or emotional pain, each memoirist must be prepared to be touched by events she may think have long since lost power to affect her. And I'll say from personal experience, this is totally true. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty candid, and I've always been candid about the crazy stuff in my life. But man, when you start writing about it, it gets kind of intense. Mm-hmm. And you come up with different conclusions about things that have happened.
And the too long didn't read version of this chapter is basically avoid adjectives and adverbs, use lively verbs, use specific nouns.
Yes. So this is the advice from Stephen King, saying don't use adverbs and adjectives. Do you not use adverbs and adjectives?
Well, I liked her comment that one of the reasons not to use them is when they're redundant. You say he runs quickly. There's no point. If you say it's a slow-moving turtle, like you shouldn't use your adverbs and adjectives that just reinforce what's already there.
I see.
But, you know, if it's a quick-moving turtle, you might want to say that. I think the trick of it is if they're what you expect anyway.
If you keep getting that comment about the show don't tell rule or you're not using enough details, I actually did this as an undergrad. I didn't get that comment a lot, but I wanted to be really good at writing. And I thought, okay, concrete language is the way to do it. So I forbade myself from using adjectives and adverbs just as an exercise, as an activity. And once in a while, they'd make themselves in there. And I go, well, if it's once in a while, it's not going to hurt anything. But it really makes a big difference. Anyway, it's a good activity.
It is. It's like isolating a particular muscle. If you want to make it work, you got to just focus on that muscle. If you don't allow yourself to use adverbs and adjectives, you're going to have to come up with better words.
That's how I taught myself how to type. You just don't look at the keys, right? You just don't let yourself do that thing. It's a good activity, I think. All right, so those are the 2 chapters. And we're going to do the one where we read memoirs and we pull out the timestamps.
Yeah, we're going to do that. And we'll come back in a moment and talk about it. And we're back.
And we're back.
So let's start by just reading the exercise that we're doing so it's clear.
Okay, so this is the first activity at the end of chapter 6, moving around in time. Find 2 or 3 short memoirs, short story length as opposed to book length, and for each one, create a timeline. As you make the timeline, list in your notebook the words or phrases the author uses to pinpoint a particular time, whether it be a specific day or an identifiable span of time. Phrases such as later that day, when I moved to Philadelphia, my second year in college, or long before that summer, and so on.
So the great thing about this one was that we did not have to write ahead of time. We just got together and we've been sitting down looking at memoirs, and Renee has one and I have a couple. We're going to do Renee's here in this episode, and then we'll discuss the memoirs that I went through next week on our workshop episode.
Okay, so this one is called, or I did my timeline from a short memoir called Blood Quantum by Daniel Geller. This comes out of an anthology called The Best of Brevity, which is edited by Zoe Bossier and Dinty W. Moore. This is a really, really good book, a really good primer. They're short, they're really good, and I believe they're all published on the website of the Creative Nonfiction website. You might have to pay, though. But if you're ever teaching a class on memoir, I highly suggest maybe teaching The Best of Brevity. It's really good.
Or if you don't want to fill your bookcase full of memoirs to research, you can pick something like this up and just study.
Yeah, I use them a lot. Before I start writing, sometimes it's nice to get a little I'm going to wet my whistle with some good stuff. And you like the ones you found, right?
Yeah, I found some good ones. So what did you pick?
This one's called Blood Quantum by Daniel Geller. And so I wrote a timeline. I wrote a line, and then I just put all the things that she talks about in her short creative nonfiction piece. And mine, luckily, is linear.
So it just starts right at the beginning and goes all the way through?
Sort of, yes. And it also has that now, that quote unquote now that Barrington talks about, where it's somewhere usually after all of this has taken place. And that is the anchor for all of the other
Can you
stuff.
read when she puts the anchor in? Does it actually say now versus then? Or is it just kind of assumed?
So it's her musing or reflecting on things. For example, she in the first paragraph, halfway through, she says, "My few memories of that visit have been pieced together from stories I've been told." Mm-hmm. So she's already been told these things, and she's piecing memories together. So we know that this is some kind of future self that she's writing from. In the next paragraph, the very beginning, she says, "What the certificate proves is that I have half-degree Navajo Indian blood, and my census roll number is 636234. So it's like, okay, she's looking at this primary document, and she's reflecting on it.
So is the essay also set up for as she discovers this stuff, or is it basically, it goes just linear based on the stuff that she's learned?
No, it's linear based on things that people have told her in her small connection to her identity as being half Navajo. So let me just get a quick breakdown of what this is about. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in this piece, it is about the author coming to terms with her Native American heritage, because she looks Native American, but being raised by her white grandmother in a very white place and not having her parents. Mm-hmm. And so what is her identity? She essentially scraps together things that people have told her or experiences she's had that link her to her Native American ancestry.
Okay. So do you want to read some of the stuff on your timeline?
Yeah. In the timeline, she's going back and talking about, in a linear fashion, things that have tied together that link her to her Native American ancestry. The first one is, quote, "A few days before I turned 3 years old." So now we're like a few days before she turned 3 years old. She is going with her family. She's going from Florida to Willow Rock, Navajo Nation.
Okay.
On that trip, although times are not specified, she says somewhere in Texas. So from Florida to Arizona, when they got to Texas, the cat jumped out of the car and her father was bitten by a brown recluse, and then he was arrested. But they did make it to the reservation. So this started a few days before she was 3, but then it's during the trip. How long does it take to get from Florida to Arizona?
It kind of depends how you do it.
Right. And with all the arrest and everything, I'd assume she was already 3 years old by the time they got to the reservation. Then she says, nearly 2 years later, on May 3rd, 1991, very specific date, right? So she knows exactly, because she probably has a primary document saying these things. 40 days after the courts granted my white grandmother legal custody of my sister and me. So this is an interesting sentence, because we're anchored in time to 40 days after something had already taken place, which is mentioned after the fact.
Right.
So I thought that was really interesting. So you learn that something happened 40 days after, but we don't know what that is until after she mentions 40 days after. Blah, blah, blah. Nearly 2 years later, on May 3rd, 1991, Florida's Office of Vital Statistics issued me a new birth certificate. 40 days after the courts granted my white grandmother legal custody of my sister and me. So there's 2 timelines in one sentence.
Mm-hmm. It also deepens it. Like, it's one thing to get a new birth certificate, but then you realize exactly what's all going into it, that there's a lot of drama.
There's a lot of drama. Yeah, just revolving around this primary document. It's a good sentence. There's so much packed into it. Mm-hmm. She does give a specific date, but she says nearly 2 years later. So it means that you have to do a little bit of math.
Right.
So I did the math, and now she is 5 years old in 1991. And then there's the 40 days later for the birth certificate. Then it jumps. A few years after the adoption, my grandmother moved us to a little town called Yo, the whitest place on earth. I assumed a few years later. A few to me means 3,
Right.
give or take. So now she's 8 years old. Mm-hmm. Then it jumps again. But once, as I sat in the empty hallway of my middle school, an older man stopped in front of me. Middle school, so it jumps from 8 years old to middle school, so I'm assuming like 12 or 13 years old.
Yep, sounds right.
Then it leaps again, and this is all one paragraph, by the way. This one paragraph is the last paragraph of the piece, and it starts with middle school and then ends while she's in high school. And then she says, when I was 15 and cleaning tables at Hardee's. So she's 15 years old, and now she's cleaning tables at Hardee's. That's 2 years later, 2-ish years later. And then 1 year later, and once when I was 16 and cleaning the snow off my grandmother's car. So she goes from 13 to 15 to 16, and that's it. Then there is an unspecified moment in time. She talks about being 16, and then weeks later something happens. And then she says, and once when I told the man on the bus that I was not Latina but Native American, he asked me to what degree. So this is once. It's like, when did that happen? But it was clearly after 16 and after the weeks after she was 16 and that.
But before the now.
Before the now. And then there's one last one, which she says, but once when I came home with a barbell through my tongue and a ring through my nose, my white grandmother said. And that is like, but once when? But clearly she's still young and she's still living with her grandmother.
No, that sounds more like she's visiting home.
Maybe.
Because you wouldn't, a barbell, what was it? She's got a barbell in her.
When I came home with a barbell through my tongue and a ring through my nose.
That would be one night of piercing to come right back and do that. It sounds more like, that's more like out at college or something like that.
Ah, okay. So maybe she in her 20s.
Yeah.
Something we do in our 20s.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the timeline moves forward, but it is told from a specific anchor or some unidentified specific anchor in now.
It's kind of interesting is the now is completely nebulous. Like, actually, no, the way you can figure it out a little bit is she does give you a couple of dates. There was one where, like, when she got her birth certificate changed.
In 1991.
So you can actually figure out what the maximum age she could be and when all this stuff was happening.
True, because the date of the publication, when it was published in 2016.
So that's, we have to do math now.
Oh, golly gee.
9 plus 16 is 25.
Okay.
25 years later.
25 years later. So she was 25 years later, or she was 25?
Well, she was, this is 25 years after she got the birth certificate changed, and she was, we said 5 then, so about 30 years old.
She's around 30.
And it doesn't matter for reading this memoir. If you're just casually reading the memoir, it doesn't really matter how old the current, well, it does matter a little bit how old the current writer is, what their now is, because it does affect the whole thing.
Well, there's a set of assumptions, right? So you assume that she's on the other side of something, right? She's created a distance between the events that happened in her childhood and her adult self, and she's able to, like, repackage them in something readable. So that creates, like, some kind of distance you have to have in order to do that successfully. The other thing is that she's become a writer. And so there's a series of assumptions where she had to learn how to write. There's a whole education going on and practice and revision and stuff that's taken place long after, well, I don't know how long, but it must have been years because nobody writes this well out of nowhere.
Right.
Right? It'd be very hard to believe that this was like an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
I assume this is long after college.
Yeah, there's a reflective quality to the whole thing.
There's a reflective quality that's only earned after you've taken time away from something and really thought about it. I'm assuming 30s, and you're assuming 30s.
Yeah.
Right? And given the date of the publication, that kind of proves it too, right?
Right.
I don't know, what kind of person do you think oh, well, we'd have to read the whole thing for us to understand the kind of person that she is.
Yes, that's one thing about getting a snapshot like this. But it's interesting that even in a snapshot, there's a very clear timeline.
Right. Well, the last sentence will give you a taste of the kind of narrator this is, which I really like her. She says, "When I came home with a barbell through my tongue and a ring through my nose, my white grandmother said in disgust, 'It must be the Indian in you,' which is always cheerlessly funny to me because I never felt Indian at all." Little fuck you to grandma. So I like this narrator. She's spunky and snarky. And you got a taste of it too.
Yeah.
But what did we learn from all this? Do you think this was a helpful activity?
Oh, I think it is. Like you said, it's a really great lens to do text analysis and to improve your craft by seeing how other people do it. And if we just read that just straight, chances are we would focus on like the cool snarky thing she said or maybe the emotional response, but we wouldn't actually see the underpinnings of how she worked it out.
Yeah.
Time-wise.
It reveals the magic that Barrington was talking about, how easy it is to orient a reader, how critical it is, but how easy. She goes through a lot of ages. And this one piece that's like 2 pages long spans from 3 years old to 16 years old and in a nebulous now. And all she had to say was a few days before I turned 3. That's all you need to know. And somehow our brains are capable of being there. Then she says somewhere in Texas. Okay, your brain kind of already does math between the miles of Florida to Arizona, and then we're in Texas. And then, 2 years after grandma got custody. It's like, okay, we do a little bit of math. 40 days later, I don't even think about it. Mm-hmm. Right. I actually did have to do the math. I was like, oh yeah, this is 2 years later. So she's 5. But if I was just reading this, I wouldn't have done the math.
Right.
I would have just been like, oh, she's a little bit older.
Mm-hmm.
The transitions and signposts don't have to be overly complicated. They could be very simple facts. They probably should be, but they have to be there, or the reader's going to get confused.
I definitely agree about the signposts being very simple. I was actually thinking, given what we read about for the exercise, that they might be more complicated. I was kind of disappointed by how very basic they were. But we can get to that when we go through some of the pieces that I read, and that will be next week. Before we sign off, again, we have our process group and our writing sprints on Wednesday. We'd love to have you attend. And if you are listening to this and you've gotten this far, could you please go to the Apple Podcast and give us a rating, even just a rating, or maybe a little review? That'd be great. We'd really appreciate that.
We would very, very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga-Otto. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
Okay, I'm just going to say this because I can't help myself. Comma splice is 2 independent clauses connected with a comma. You can't do that. You have to add a coordinator of some kind or